Thank you, John. That was a terrific, great way to start things. Our next speaker is Malcolm Feeley, a professor of law at Berkeley. He received his BA from Austin College, his PhD from the University of Minnesota, and he was a fellow at Yale Law School. With Edward Rubin, he wrote Federalism, Political Identity and Tragic Compromise, a theoretical investigation of federalism that Larry Yackles describes as, quote, an insightful investigation of federalism stripped of its romance. Didn't realize there was much romance in South Dakota versus Dole. The essence of his book suggests that federalism has become obsolete in the 21st century. We look forward to hearing from you, Professor Feeley.
Thank you. They needed to get somebody from Berkeley at this at the Federalist Society, and John Yu's too busy working for John Chapman, and so he forwarded the email to me, and I'm here whether you like it or not. At any rate, as you know, winners write history, and Alexander Hamilton was on the winning side, as we suggested in defining. But losers write, and sometimes people go back and read their stuff, even though it's difficult to find in print. And just last week, I had my students read Federalist 78, the great defense of the federal judiciary, the proposed judiciary in the Constitution, and as well as judicial review. Hamilton in this does a wonderful job. It's the Goldilocks theory of the court. It's not too strong, it's not too weak, it's just right. It has enough power, but it has enough power to control the Congress and limit the Congress, but not so much power it's going to take off and be independent on its own. Well, we might question that. Many of you would, but there was a response to Hamilton by one Brutus, and his talk, his writing, I think, is even more interesting. First of all, he shows that Hamilton was a fantastic rhetorician and not a very good political theorist, maybe. What Brutus says is beware of 78 and beware of the proposal and beware of the Constitution. Remember, the anti-federalists were the op-eds against it. Brutus goes on to say, look, the issue is not how much power the court has vis-a-vis the Congress and a little bit the presidency, but he didn't anticipate the growth of the presidency. Brutus says the real issue is that a powerful court is going to join a powerful Congress and run roughshod over the states. And it's clear that Brutus was absolutely right. His worst nightmare has occurred. Now, the difference between Brutus and me is Brutus would wake up and say it's a nightmare, and I would say it's a good thing too. So I want to stand back and try to give an account for them. In the book that Dean Rubin and I recently published called Federalism, Political Identity and Tragic Compromise, we try to give a political, not a legal, but a political theoretical analysis of federalism. And our argument is that twofold. One, that successful nation states and stable nation states require a population that has a strong political identity around the nation state. And the trouble with federalism is that it is a type of bifurcated national state that creates two identities. And while identity is socially constructed, this is the postmodern analysis we all accept now, at least one exception to that is political identity. Political entities are defined geographically, and it's hard to have two identities. What do we mean by identity? It means the willingness to kill and die for your state. Once in the United States, we may have had two political identities where people were willing to kill and die for two. But since the Civil War, I think that has gone aside, has gone the past. And if it's not the Civil War, it's the Civil War amendments. If it's not the Civil War amendments, it's the Progressive Era. If it's not the Progressive Era, it is the New Deal. If it's not the New Deal, it's the Second Reconstruction. If it's not the Second Reconstruction, it is the Rights Revolution. And if it's not the Rights Revolution, it's the economic crisis that we find ourselves in. So my argument is that there is no coherent analysis and defense of federalism. It is a tragic compromise that Hamilton and others saw at the outset between the small states and the large states and the slave states and the free states. And as those issues resolved away, so too did the issue of federalism. And so in this sense, there's one area I can agree with John Eastman about, and that is almost all our doctrine on federalism is incoherent. But it seems to me, I take that as evidence that federalism is not a very viable idea in modern administrative state. Federalisms will either dissolve, and most federalisms throughout history have dissolved, or they will resolve into something approaching a unitary state. What looks like federalism today is decentralization, and it's not surprising in a big and massive country, mass and size, that we would have a great deal of decentralization. One type of federalism that looks like it's consistent with modern times is fiscal federalism, the idea that states are laboratories of change or engines for competition and so on and so forth. It is only federalism, I think, so-called. It is really decentralization. Indeed, the economists who invented the term fiscal federalism now recant the term, saying we sowed more confusion than enlightenment, and we want to call it decentralization. Why? Because economists would recognize the obvious, that economists want to marry the benefits with the costs, and those don't necessarily go along state lines. You need special districts to get catchment areas so those that receive the benefits can pay the costs, and so on. And state lines may occasionally do that, but by and large, they don't. The other great defense of federalism, and one that the lineage can go back to the Middle Ages, is the principle of subsidiarity. Not a bad theory. Subsidiarity principle holds that the lowest, the most local unit of authority that can handle a problem ought to handle the problem. It's a good principle, a good rule of thumb, but that principle or rule of thumb is a functional principle that would say those units will vary according to the nature of the problem and the nature of the situation. It does not privilege a sovereign entity that might be called a state. Indeed, the theory behind it runs exactly to the contrary, because it's a functional analysis that says carve out what you need when you need it and be prepared to change when you need it and what you need it. So what does all this say about the current economic crisis? Not a whole lot at all, other than be prepared for one more round of centralization. Now, it would seem to me that people in the Federalist Society ought to be concerned about the centralization with respect to recent fiscal policy. But the issue, it ought to be reformulated. It's certainly not states versus the national government, but rather it is the Congress versus the president, or the failure of Congress versus the expansive presidency. Books are being dusted off. Clinton Rossiter's book, written 61 years ago, is now being dusted off, called Constitutional Dictatorship, is now being dusted off and read by liberals. Rossiter was worried about the concentration of power in the executive during the war, during the Depression, and again during the war. It's now in its nth printing, and lots of people, including my good liberal friends, are reading it. Carl Schmitt, of all people, is now being dusted off and read around the country, including by people in the Justice Department. Carl Schmitt, as you may know, was the brilliant Nazi legal theorist who argued for the emergency declaration that suspended the Constitution in the early 30s in Germany. And so as we see, as it seems to me that the central issue now is to try to figure out how to it's going back maybe to Hamilton's question, how to innervate the Congress against a president, Republicans and Democrats, who view themselves as solo policymakers. Imagine the authority that we vested in George Bush, and imagine that same authority being carried over and being invested in Barack Obama, which it has. Do we want our secretaries of Treasury? Do we want our presidents? Do we want our chairs of central banks exercising such power without congressional oversight? So the issue, it seems to me, of financing and the crisis is the issue of congressional oversight of the executive.